Hi, it's Matt here with this week's external monitoring from Murphy Solution. And this week, a slightly longer one, but nevertheless interesting, especially given what's going on in the world. And if last year's sense of general tension was a Dodgems ride, then the escalating geopolitical competition we've seen in the first 3 weeks of 2026 surely has to be a rollercoaster. The US military intervention in Venezuela is the most widely covered occurrence of the year so far, but there are so many simmering and potential flashpoints, which strangely now include Greenland of all places, that the rules-based international order seems to be under constant and increasing challenge. So we're going to take a look at what the rules-based international order is and where it comes from, how the different interpretations of it have created the current conditions, and finish with some implications for crisis management and resilience for global businesses. So part one, what is the rules-based international order and where does it come from? Well, it refers to the idea that relations between states should be governed by agreed rules, norms and institutions rather than by raw power alone. And it largely originates from the post-World War II settlement when governments sought to prevent a return to catastrophic conflict by embedding cooperation in law and institutions. Its core principles included respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, limits on the use of force, treaties, institutions and courts to manage trade, finance, security and settle disputes, and sense of predictability and stability in international relations that support global growth. Over time, this framework has expanded beyond those basic coexistence to include expectations around human rights, economic openness, and collective enforcement. The prevailing attitude in the Western world was a fundamental shared belief in the assumption that rules mattered more than power. And over time, there's been increasing contest over that belief, what counts as the rules and how they're interpreted and applied. So part two, what are the different interpretations of the rules-based international order and how have they created the trends that we're currently seeing? Well, as with most contemporary global issues, the situation is nuanced. It can't easily be reduced to a disagreement between democracies and autocracies, as in the Cold War era, and it can't be resolved through a character-limited social media post. Many alleged that recent events such as Trump administration's military intervention in Venezuela signify the end of the rules-based international order. Longtime critics suggest its demise began back in 2003 with the US-led coalition in the Middle East after the events of 9/11. For others, it might have been Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 or the subsequent invasion of Ukraine in 2022 that were the clearest indicators. But is it an indicator of the order dying or diverging? So let's explore this. Broadly speaking, there are two main visions of the rules-based international order that coexist. The first is an interpretation centered in sovereignty, where rules exist mainly to manage coexistence between states, protect non-interference and ensure predictability, but don't challenge the domestic systems or justify external pressure. This view resists what it sees as non-consensual rules or norms being imposed by an exclusive group of countries. Countries such as Russia and China and many in the global south gravitate towards this interpretation, and it can be part of why attitudes to human values and rights differ in these places. The second interpretation is embedded in liberal principles, where rules are linked to human and political values such as democracy, human rights and accountability. A wider set of norms, standards and procedures that may not be part of formal binding international law and where enforcement is seen as legitimate. Practitioners of both interpretations claim to be defending the international order. Both invoke the same institutions, albeit to a greater or lesser extent, and legal language, but they differ on legitimacy, enforcement, and more importantly, who decides on what the rules are and when they're broken. The latter, liberal interpretation, has historically been the dominant position of many Western-oriented states. It's an interpretation that the US has historically helped define and lead since the post-World War II era and is largely attributed to the decades of global prosperity that we've seen. To many, that likely explains why the approach being taken by the current administration of the US appears confusing. But others may say that the liberal values-based interpretation has always given the Western world the ability to pick and choose how it applies the rules, just that it was done less brazenly in the past, perhaps out of some sense of respect for constituents, allies, or self. Trump's administration characterizes an overt shift from the predominantly liberal interpretation of the rules-based international order to a more selective but unpredictable interpretation. Its application is defined by a bipolar view of sovereignty, coveting one's own but no one else's, a transaction-based approach to policy and diplomacy rather than value-based, and a reduced appetite for working with other states by delegitimizing international institutions and alliances, and monetizing shared interests for self-gain. This helps explain the current global trends we're seeing of fragmentation and de-risking, where trade is conducted based on strategic geopolitical considerations rather than purely economic efficiency, and where diversification away from unreliable partners helps mitigate risk, but full decoupling might not be possible. We're also seeing weakening multilateralism, and that's the practice of countries working together to solve shared problems. It's driven by diverging ideologies and differing worldviews, and that's reducing the influence and effectiveness of global institutions. More frequent unilateral actions, justified as exceptional or unprecedented, actually go largely unopposed due to normalization of sensationalist headlines and misinformation causing cognitive overload if there's too many things to investigate, care about, or correct. This might lead other powers to become more emboldened in their own selective approaches. And finally, great power rivalry, which is increasingly contesting norms around trade, security, and law, and leads to the creation of normative blocks that are aligned based on perceived shared values and regime type, not just strategic interests. So we're likely to see flare-ups and frictions instigated by what previously would have been non-headline making occurrences. The idea that systemic competition has existed alongside values-based diplomacy has been around for a while, but the recent discomfort stems from the level of unpredictability we're seeing play out in the US's interpretation of the order, and the ability for those countries that still believe in the liberal interpretation to produce a coordinated response. This can be particularly concerning for how globally operating or connected organizations manage and mitigate risk and maintain their resilience. So on to part 3. What might this growing divide and unpredictability mean for crisis management and resilience within globally operating or connected businesses? Well, the implications are that the operating environment is no longer shaped by a single broadly accepted rule set, but by overlapping, competing, and sometimes incompatible systems of rules, norms, and expectations. Crisis management is becoming more complex, both in scope and need. Crises are no longer just operational disruptions, they are increasingly emerging as geo-legal, regulatory, and reputational crises, triggered by geopolitical shifts and sudden changes in how rules are interpreted and enforced. Actions may be legal in one jurisdiction, but unacceptable or sanctionable in another. And it's also likely that actions could broadly be praised despite their illegality, or condemned in spite of being legal. In some areas, disputes may not be reconcilable through existing institutional mechanisms, potentially leaving companies exposed. Organizations must manage not only compliance, but navigate the potential for plurality across narratives and legitimacy, how their actions are perceived by stakeholders across diverse political and normative environments, even across regions. For resilience, in this environment, it means more than redundancy or diversification. It increasingly refers to an organization's ability to operate across multiple normative systems simultaneously, which may be increasingly challenging. Supply, revenue, and value chains are all exposed to regulatory spillovers, where decisions taken in one jurisdiction may have unanticipated consequences elsewhere. Global supply chains are likely to react to strategic competition more than commercial logic. De-risking is critical. Legal, financial, data, and logistics systems may expose single points of failure if they are overly dependent on jurisdictions, institutions, or partners whose reliability is no longer assured. Where full decoupling is not possible, resilience will depend on optionality, alternative pathways that can be activated when conditions change. The most resilient organisations will be those that assume geopolitical volatility will be permanent rather than temporary. That plural rules and narratives are now a feature of the system, not an anomaly. And that they need to confront and answer the questions that were previously considered political rather than commercial in regular strategic, contractual and steering document reviews. And I'll leave you for the rest of the week with a thought. The period of time we're currently in, the one that can at times feel like a dystopian Netflix series, reminds me of a quote from the Italian Marxist thinker Antonio Gramsci, of all people. He said, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old order is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." Gramsci used this concept to analyse the political situation in Europe following World War I, and used the word interregnum to describe a time when the established dominant social and political order had entered into crisis and was no longer capable of maintaining its full authority. But a new alternative order had not fully coalesced and taken its place. The morbid symptoms he referred to were the various political, social and economic illnesses that emerge during periods of instability and transition. 2025 seemed to be dominated by a sense of disbelief over whether and to what extent the US was embracing competitive authoritarianism, and for those opposed, if anything could be done to stop it. And as we start 2026, almost 100 years after Gramsci was imprisoned by Mussolini around 1930, his quote still holds relevance for the challenges of today. It's often used to describe situations of prolonged deadlock, instability and profound uncertainty during periods of historical change, and appropriately describes the growing divide between those that believe in traditional interpretations of the rules-based international order and those that are transitioning to interpretations they feel better suit their interests. For businesses, the challenge is less about being able to predict exactly what comes next, and more about being able to operate responsibly and to adapt resiliently to whatever that might look like. The questions that Gramsci's quote inspires are, to what extent are we in a period of historical change? Or is it just temporary? To what extent are the smaller states able to defend their own or old interpretations of the order? And to what extent will the world order change if more states are emboldened to develop and selectively apply their own interpretations in ways that align with their own interests? That's it for this week's External Monitoring. We'll see you next time.